Major guilds maintained a fairly solid monopoly on trade in their fields throughout the city. Thus, whenever an interloper attempted to ply their wares of the same sort, they would be rebuffed by the significant guild. Any craftsman in Florence had to also be a member of a guild most of the time to have a hope of making any sort of living. The most powerful guild was the Della Lana, or Wool Guild, and other textile workers. The Wool Guild alone boasted 30,000 employed workers and 200 factories throughout Florence. This was because a major means of income for the city was cloth. They often bought superior quality wool that was unfinished and untreated from Iberia and England. The wool was then cleaned, carded, spun, dyed, and woven into a superb quality cloth. The cloth was then sold to places such as Italy, some Eastern countries, and Northern European cities. However, as it was not a port city, this did not account for most of its income. Much more was made in banking, another major influence and power. This was the city's secret to its bustling commerce and immense wealth. Standards for quality and method, thus seeking to ensure consistently fine goods were produced. Each guild had its own individual officials and treasuries. They also established rules and regulations for taking on and the training of apprentices, who would learn from a master of a trade to, in time, become a master themselves. After 2 to 7 years of training, they would become a journeyman. As a journeyman, they would be able to earn a salary and be hired out. To become a master, they needed to produce a masterpiece, which would be accepted by the guild in question, granting them the master craftsman title. This also allowed to take on apprentices of their own. At this time, those in guilds were also the only individuals eligible to vote or hold any political office. Thus, every governmental position was filled by a guild member. This had the effect of many more decisions being made to support the working class and increase the beauty of the city through art and architecture. Each guild also had their own individual representative in government with which to further their goals to a greater extent. Constructed in 1299, the Palazzo Vecchio served as the home of the Florentine guilds. Even to the modern day, it functions as the heart of the city and its municipal government. There, the 5,000 strong guild members gathered to vote on important issues affecting the city and her people. Many guilds had their beginnings as religious organizations, which was not completely erased in their new purpose. They still each claimed a patron saint as representative of their craft, and also organized different holidays and festivals. Overall, guilds played a very important role in Florence's society. They were a major part of both its trade and government, and as an essential cornerstone to the city's finances and culture, it surely would not be the same without the organization and persistence of so many artists and craftsmen.
The next discussion is what is the impact of the guild to the Florence? Guild give a big impact to the Florence. First, they protect the economic interests of their members or even the consumers. So we can know that probably they help the economy most of the people that time by several ways, like they don't allow goods to be imported to the town if they competed with the local products. It helped the guilds to hold the monopoly of the market within its own town. They also were part cartel and part labor union and regulated all aspects of particular trades. Also, that guilds not only bringing funds, but also their commitment and credibility to the artistic to restore the north and the south doors of the baptistry of Santa Maria del Fiore in Florence. Guilds also gives many benefits to their members and their consumers, especially to their members. They provide funeral expenses for the poorer members and aid to the survivors. They provide dowries for poor girls. They cover members with a type of health insurance and provision for care of the sick. They built chapels. They donated windows to local churches or cathedrals. They frequently help in the actual construction of the churches. They watch over the morals of the members who indulge in gambling and usury, and also they were very important for their contribution to emergence of Western lay education. Because in earlier times, the only schools in existence had been the monastic or only the cathedral schools. Each guild was required to perform public services. They took turns policing the streets and also constructed public buildings and also defend the town or city. The majority in guilds are men. Most guilds excluded women, but some allowed women to join, those at the same time excluding them from full participation in social activities. Some of the guilds allowing women were those of the butchers, ironmongers, shoemakers, hot food sellers, bookbinders, and goldsmiths. Still others, such as those involving domestic activities such as brewing, spinning, and silk making, were exclusively female industries. If a woman found herself widowed, she was allowed to practice the trade of her deceased husband. These women could then become a masters in the trade, but usually were required to give up their membership in their guild if they married men belonging to the different guilds. There are some weaknesses that the guild system have, that is, inability to adjust itself to technological progress. Like the guild member actually could not use a new method when it is not accepted yet by the guild and provided from its regulations. So, it means that any innovators were forced to work outside the jurisdiction or even not having protection from the guilds. Not all professions actually were organized into guilds, and in smaller communities, there might not be enough members of a particular craft or profession to form a guild.
Now that you've heard of the basic knowledge of guilds, let's touch on Florence, specifically the guilds in Florence. Not all guilds were created equal in Florence. Florence had 7 major guilds, called the Arti Majori, and 14 minor guilds, or Arti Minori. The wealthiest and most powerful men in Florence belonged to the major guilds. This were the Arte della Calimala, the wool and fabric merchants, the Arte della Lana, the wool manufacturers, the Arte de Giudici Notai, the magistrates and notaries, the Arte del Cambio, the bankers, the Arte del Seta, the silk weavers and metal workers, the Arte de Medici e Speziali, which were the physicians, the pharmacists, and painters, and the Arte de Viai e Pellici, which were the skinners and furriers. The Guild of Arte de Lana, which was the wool guild, was very important in Florence. The Arte de Lana dealt with woolen cloth and cooperated with other corporations of bankers and merchants in administrating the commune both under the Podesta and Republic of Florence. At the height of the industry, the Arte della Lana directly employed 300 workers and indirectly about a third of Florence's population and produced around 100,000 lengths of cloth annually. The Arte della Lana saw all of the processes from the raw baled wool through the final cloth, woven at numerous looms scattered in homes throughout the city. The predecessor, and until the mid-14th century, the rival of the Arte della Lana was the powerful Arte de Calamala, a corporation of importers of raw cloth who dyed and finished it. The Arte de Calamala, the guild of the cloth finishers and merchants in foreign cloth, was one of the greater guilds of Florence. The members of the Calamala were the complete elite of Florence. The capital required and the credit network that activated it meant the members of the Calamala, like the Scali, turned naturally to banking to complement their activities as merchants, who might turn a profit in grain or real estate holdings. Another Arte Majori was the Arte della Sella, which was the silk guild of Florence in the late Middle Ages during the Renaissance. The Florentine silk merchants were both traders and weavers. They started cultivation of silkworms, which until the end of the 14th century was not practiced in Tuscany. But the real silk industry Florentine reached was the highest levels in the 15th century, when it appeared the fabrics damask and brocades woven with gold and silver threads, which quickly became famous and exported all throughout Europe. The last guild I will be talking about is the Arte di Viai e Pagliacci, which were skinners and furriers. The Florentine furriers imported animal skins from Europe, continental, and the Middle East. Most commonly, it was the gray squirrel, as they were soft and kept people warm. Oftentimes, animals' tails were sewn on
pieces of clothing like hats and jackets as a pendant and more as decoration. They also hunted minks, foxes, bears, and rams.
The Arte Judici Notae was made up of judges, lawyers, and notaries. A notary is someone who is authorized to sign legal documents in the court of law. This guild was the highest ranking and most prestigious guild in Florence, with the most power and thus the most politicians. All recorded laws and legal regulations were made under the control of this guild. At its peak of 1338 CE, the guild included 80 lawyers and 600 notaries. Sadly, most of the legal documents the guild created were lost in the passage of time. To become a lawyer in Florence, you could not be of illegitimate birth, nor could you be a heretic or part of the clergy. Being a music teacher, or a foreigner, or a gravedigger were grounds for disqualification as well. If these disqualifications were not met, then you went to an Italian university for 5 years before taking a test given out by the guild. If you passed, you were a lawyer. As for notaries, the qualifications were much more relaxed, but you had to be introduced to the guild by another notary who vouches for you, pass through 3 different exams, and then swear to the court of law. In 1597, the Guild of Judges and Notaries was abolished. That same year, a College of Notaries was founded. The Art del Cambio was the Bankers' Guild, with most of their buildings in the city center. The city center was demolished in 1881 to 1895. In 1252, when the guild was newly formed, they created the golden florin, a new type of gold standard currency, and the first one to be created in significant quantities since the 600s. The result was that it spread Florentine banks across Europe, making the coin the choice for large transactions. This guild was mainly for the Medici family and associates, as the Medici formed a bank in 1397 under Giovanni di Bicci Medici. Unfortunately, after the death of his son, Cosimo, the bank started to decline due to bad credit risks. 2 years after the death of Lorenzo the Magnificent in 1492, the bank was dissolved. Lorenzo's death, in fact, heralded the end of the Golden Age of Florence, as the fragile peace between the Italian city-states collapsed with his death. This guild was disbanded in 1770 by Grand Duke Peter Leopold of Lorraine. E speciali were physicians, doctors, pharmacists, and also painters. The painters joined them due to the guild being their supplier of raw materials like pigments and coloring compounds. This guild also had apothecaries who sold medicinal herbs and drugs. Like the bankers, this guild was disbanded in 1770 by Grand Duke Peter Leopold. The guilds were not limited to these 7 major guilds. Other guilds included butchers, blacksmiths, shoemakers, tavern and hotel keepers, carpenters, a guild for those who sold salt and cheese, weapon and armor makers, locksmiths, bakers, and more. Though the major guilds were the ticket to real political power, and it was very rare for those in minor guilds to get their name out there to an extent that we know of them today, the minor ones existed to help those in their professions.